Good morning and welcome to the Point. This may have been one of the most contentious weeks of the Trump presidency. I know, that's saying something. There weren't hundreds of thousands of people protesting across the country like we have seen, but for the first time, the U.S. House of Representatives took up a policy matter that candidate Trump made a part of every one of his campaign stops. That was to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, what he calls Obamacare. The internet, social media, broadcast media exploded with all of the things that might happen after a narrow margin of Republicans said yes to a plan that was introduced, pulled back, modified, and finally passed on Thursday. But it's far from the final word when it comes to what's going to happen with health care. One of the people involved in making changes to that plan was Michigan Congressman Fred Upton. Shortly after the vote, I talked to him and I asked him about what would happen in the Senate.
For sure, the Senate's going to have a different bill. There's no question about that. Whether it's on expanded Medicaid, those states that expanded Medicaid, and we're one of those 31 states. Whatever it might be, their bill for sure will be different. There'll be a conference. We'll work out the details. It'll be a number of months down the line. I'm convinced that the bill will only get better. But for me, again, that line in the sand is, what are we doing on pre-existing benefits or pre-existing illnesses?
So there was a policy decision made on health care this week, but just by the U.S. House. The Senate will take it up now, and no doubt they'll take much longer to take a look at some of the provisions they'd like included in a new health care plan. Then the two sides will come together. The question is, can they craft a plan that can pass both the House and the Senate? We probably won't know for months, but we'll continue to watch that. One other thing that happened in Washington this week, a spending plan was put in place that will carry the government through this fiscal year. Before either of those votes were taken, I sat down with the chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party. We talked about both things. Here's what Brandon Dillon had to say about what we expected. Again, we talked before either of those votes were taken.
Well, yeah, I mean, the last thing we need is to shut down the government, even though I think Donald Trump said the other day, what we need is a good government shutdown. You usually don't see that kind of problem happening when one party controls the entire Congress and the presidency, but it is a good thing. There are essential services that people need, whether it's veterans benefits, homeowners trying to get loans, Social Security checks that need to be sent out. But what I think the funny thing, if you're looking at this, is all of the proclamations that Donald Trump made on the campaign trail about building a wall and having Mexico pay for it, or defunding Planned Parenthood, and all the other red meat he threw out. Those things either didn't happen or the programs are going to continue to be funded at this point. So really this is a negotiation between Republicans at this point. Democrats don't have the vote to block anything. I'm glad they are not shutting down the government, but I do think this sets up a continued process where there's going to be tensions about those priorities that Donald Trump wants and what I think even sane Republicans realize is just not in the interest of the country.
But doesn't that create a real problem for Donald Trump and for those Republicans? Because if you say, and we'll talk about this too, repeal and replace, if you say we're going to build a wall, if you say we're going to drain the swamp,
yep.
And whether you agree as a policy matter with any of those things, as a guy who does strategy for campaigns, once you say it, you have to perform in somewhere. I mean, if you ask George Herbert Walker Bush, no new taxes, right, and then you raise taxes, that can be a problem. I mean, you have to come through on some of that, don't you?
Yes, and it wasn't just these were promises that Donald Trump said he would try to do. They were things that he said he would do and that they would be easy to do. So repeal and replace Obamacare. That hasn't happened, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's still a chance that they may pass something through the House, but it doesn't look like anything that goes through is going to be received well in the Senate. He said he was going to call China a currency manipulator on day one. Well, he has a meeting with the Chinese premier, and all of a sudden they're our best friend. He said NATO was obsolete, and he was going to change that. Well, now NATO's not obsolete. He said he was going to rip up NAFTA. Now he's decided to push that down the road as well. He said he was going to build the wall, and Mexico was going to pay for it. That hasn't happened. He said he was going to protect middle-class families from tax increases. Well, it looks like his tax plan may actually increase taxes on middle-class families, and he's proposed a an increase in the federal gas tax. So what he said on the campaign trail seems to be almost diametrically opposed to either what's happened since he's been president or what he's agreed is a priority.
What happens going forward? And I know that's a crystal ball kind of question, but the reason I ask is because it has impacts on so many levels. First of all, you talk about the way the country operates, the way the government operates, how it impacts citizens, et cetera, et cetera. But the next step then is we're 19 months from the next election, and those midterm elections become vitally important to both Democrats and Republicans. Sure. And that too can have a big impact going forward. How much from your perspective, instead of what's going to happen, let me ask it this way. How much from your perspective does this administration and or the majorities in the House and the Senate need to accomplish heading into November of 2018 in order to go back to their base and say, we've done some of what we said we were going to?
Well, I guess it depends on the specific issue. I think what you've seen since Donald Trump was elected and the Congress has begun its activities, you've seen a huge resistance out there in the general public. And these aren't just hardcore Democrats. There's people who I think woke up after the election and realized that Donald Trump was going to try to fulfill the promises that he made. So whether it's repealing the Affordable Care Act, you've seen a lot of pressure put on moderate Republicans because of issues like pre-existing conditions and the loss of 24 million people's health care, rising costs for people who have employer-based coverage or senior citizens because of their age. So if they are able to accomplish that, it may appease some on their base, but given the fact that the Affordable Care Act now has a much higher approval rating than either President Trump or the Congress, I don't know whether that's the kind of accomplishment they want to be touting going into the election. If he's able to get an infrastructure package that is something that's bipartisan and puts money into the economy to get our roads and bridges and underground infrastructure fixed, I think that's something that would appeal to the general public. But a lot of these campaign promises that he made and the Congress has tried to implement are, as you said, really just appealing to his base. And I think that's a dangerous way to approach 2018, given that you are seeing a lot of energy, not only on the Democratic side, but really in the center of people who may have either voted for Trump or weren't necessarily enamored with Hillary Clinton, but are choosing to exercise their vote in special elections across the country, whether it was in Georgia or Kansas, an election coming up in Montana. The Democratic turnout and independents who are coming out to support Democratic candidates is at a very high level at this point.
What is the path forward if we get to a point of governance? Mm-hmm. Forgetting about the elections momentarily. We still have trillions of dollars of debt at the federal level. You talk about an infrastructure plan that could add to that, possibly, although they've talked about a public-private partnership that hasn't been clearly defined. How do we get Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell to work together? How do we find that common ground between a Pelosi and a Ryan if we really want to get to governance, or are we just in full political mode all the time?
Well, I think people should, those leaders, particularly Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, and Donald Trump, the ones that actually set the agenda, should look at what the priorities of the American people seem to be at this time. The vast majority of American people do not want to repeal and replace Obamacare. They want to fix the problems that they see with it. So whether that's making improvements to the Affordable Care Act or actually trying to get at some of the issues that have come up since its implementation, I think you could get broad bipartisan consensus, and that's what the public is asking for. Whether it's tax reform, instead of offering a big giveaway to corporations and people like Donald Trump and the people at the very top, let's have broad tax reform that eases the tax burden on the middle class and doesn't explode the deficit. I think that Trump's budget director already said that they have no intention of paying for a massive tax cut at this point, which is, again, diametrically opposed to everything you've heard Republicans campaign on for the last 6 years about the exploding national debt and annual deficit. So I think if they can pick the right issues that have broad agreement in the general public, you'll see Democrats wanting to work with Republicans. But at this point, if they're going to continue to push this agenda that has really no support amongst the vast majority of Americans and is only designed to appeal to the Republican base, they should expect Democrats to continue to resist that.
As long as there is that resistance, and as you accurately pointed out, we have seen people literally take to the streets since the election. in big numbers to protest or express their opinion about any number of subjects. And as an observer, I would suggest that energy helps from your perspective on the Democratic Party. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But when you see that out there, is that representative of enough people across the spectrum? You just talked about people in the middle and perhaps Democrats as well, or people that are more left-leaning that are concerned. Is that enough to get the attention of Washington, official Washington, be it Democrats or Republicans? Because I can tell you, if you and I go walk out the street here and run into 10 people, 8 of them will say nobody listens to it.
Right. No, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's too early to know whether that gets the attention of everybody in Washington or whether it translates into votes in 2018. But I think if you look back at what happened in 2009 and 2010 after Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act, you saw a similar surge of activity on the right with the Tea Party movement and others, and all the town halls that people remember in the summer where people were very upset at the time about what they saw was a Washington overreach. Obviously, their opinions have changed, but I think you're seeing almost a mirror image of that, where people are saying, hold on, this is not what we want, this is not what we sent you to Washington to do, and we're going to push back until you listen to us. I think official Washington has gotten the message on health care. We'll see if they pass something through the House, but it is clear that what they are doing is not a popular prospect, and many Republicans, I think, are starting to recognize that and backing away from the original plans or the idea that we're just going to totally scrap the Affordable Care Act. But the challenge for Democrats is to be able to harness that energy into something productive. And you're right, elections are not won and lost on the margins. You have to motivate your base, but you also have to appeal to folks in the center and swing voters. And I think, frankly, Donald Trump is doing a good job of doing a lot of our work for us by breaking his promises and not being able to fill the things he said about draining the swamp in Washington. It looks like he's just filling the swamp with more Goldman Sachs executives and people in his staff who are now in the revolving door of government to lobbying. So we'll see how it plays out, but we feel pretty good about the energy right now and have a plan in place to really activate people and continue to have them expressing their opinions as loudly and as often as they can.
So what happens in the next election cycle? It's important because a lot of things ride on every election. We'll talk with the chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party about that next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. We continue our conversation now with the Michigan Democratic Party chairman, Brandon Dillon. Earlier, we were talking about the election past and why people did or did not vote for Hillary Clinton or for Donald Trump. Let's talk about Hillary Clinton for a moment. She said recently that if the election had been held October 27th, I think the date that she picked out, she would have won. And by the way, if you look at the numbers, even though the numbers weren't always right in this last election cycle, that may be so, but that's kind of not the typical way candidates look back. Mm-hmm. The election's over and you kind of move on. Was this just that much of a different race that even in the hindsight, even in the rearview mirror, we look at it differently because generally speaking, once a race is over, it's over. But both of these folks, Donald Trump can't quit talking about the fact that he won the election. And I get it that every time Hillary Clinton's out, she's going to be asked about it. But is it time to move on from the election of last year?
Well, I think we're still, yes. I mean, we've got a lot of important things we've got to worry about as Democrats. And rehashing the last election is important only in that it teaches us lessons that we shouldn't repeat going forward. I think the biggest lesson that is starting to emerge is we didn't do enough persuasion, and we lost voters that had voted for President Obama twice who decided to vote for Donald Trump. We've got to have a message that appeals to those folks. We've got to talk to them and make sure that we can get them back. Anything else I think is an exercise that is not beneficial to our party and to moving the country forward.
You said something that interests me greatly, talking about harnessing the energy out there. There are two parts to this question. The first part is the energy that you, as a chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party, need to harness is very visible. There are a lot of people who have been very vocal, as we've talked about. So let's start with the first part. how do you turn that activism into people who are actively campaigning, actively going door to door, actively making phone calls? Even though that's kind of the old school way of campaigning, there still is a value to that, I assume.
I think it's still the most important thing that we can do, and we've gotten away from it. What we've done at the Michigan Democratic Party is we have totally changed our focus on what we're doing in off years. We have hired on-the-ground staff to be working with local parties across the state. We had our first day of action on April 22nd, where we had hundreds of people out knocking on doors, phone banking around healthcare. We're going to be doing that every day and every month from now until 2018. And as we get forward, we're going to ramp up more. But we've found that that is the best way to harness that energy, is to give people an opportunity to actually go out and talk to other people and express what they think the values of the Democratic Party are, but more importantly, listen to them and ask them what their priorities are. So we're going to be continuing to do that. It's been very successful so far, and we think it's a model for other state parties in the country.
The other side of that question is maybe Richard Nixon's silent majority, because recent polling numbers, and again, I think we have to be a little cautious with polls, but they suggested that most of those people that voted for Donald Trump probably do it again. And that despite all of the things that you talked about in the first part of the show, that hasn't really seemed to change their opinions. So while your activists or people that you may be able to persuade are pretty vocal, is there a way to gauge what's happening with people who may not be as vocal about their support of Donald Trump?
Yeah, well, we're going to talk to everybody. We're not limiting the contact that we have just to people we think are hardcore Democrats or leaning Democrats. We want to actually be talking to independents, people that we know, for instance, that voted in the Democratic primary and then didn't show up in the general elections. 117,000 of those people in this state. We want to know why they didn't do that. We want to be able to talk to people in Macomb County and Monroe County and Bay County and Muskegon County who decided that they weren't going to support the Democratic ticket this year. So, yeah, I think that Donald Trump has remained he's got a strong base of support amongst the people that were really enthusiastic about it. But the other side is his approval ratings are at a historic low for any president at this point. And what you've seen in these special elections around the country is a real surge in Democratic performance, which can only be attributed to two things, really. An increase in base excitement, as well as folks in the middle deciding that they want to vote for the Democratic candidate as a way to show that we need to have more balance in Washington.
19 months is a long time. And to keep that enthusiasm level high and to avoid the fatigue. I mean, at some point, if there's a protest every weekend, sure. I know from a news perspective, they're newsworthy, but as they become sure. more commonplace, it's less and less newsworthy. Not that it's less and less important or less valuable, but there is a natural exhaustion point. So obviously your day of action is one way you try to combat that, but how do you keep that enthusiasm for 19 months?
Well, I think, again, Donald Trump has been our best organizer. Every day I wake up about 6 in the morning and I look at what Donald Trump tweeted 3 hours ago at 3 in the morning. I think there's going to be a never-ending series of things to motivate people to get out. But what we're looking at is the long haul. We're not looking to have flashy protests every week. We want people out talking to voters, doing the grinding work of figuring out where our voters are, what issues matter to them, and then being able to use that in 2018 to inform our candidates and also to make sure that we have a better sense of where our voters are and what we need to do to get them out.
How is the party? There was I will categorize it as a bit of a chasm between the Bernie Sanders supporters and the Hillary Clinton supporters, and that carried right through to the election of a new National Party chairperson. And that probably didn't settle that rift. Is that something that nationally and statewide you see coming together?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there's going to be people out there who are going to always have kind of a bad taste in their mouth about 2016, but I think as we get closer to 2018 and people see that the party is actually out doing the kind of grassroots organizing that I think people have been longing for a very significant period of time, that is going to get less and less divisive. We're seeing people who were active Bernie supporters running for offices within the party, participating in our caucuses and our committees. A political party is never able to satisfy everybody, but I think right now we're engaged in a very healthy process to find out who we are as Democrats, what we stand for, and then more importantly, put those values into action on the ground, talking to people throughout the year and up until those elections happen in 19 months.
Every operative and every political reporter will tell you that the next election is the most important.
They always are.
But in the case of 2018 in the state of Michigan, everything is up for grabs. One U.S. Senate seat, all of the congressional seats, all of the state House seats, all of the state Senate seats, every constitutional officer, from governor to secretary of state to attorney general, everything is going to be on the ballot. Does that make it easier or more difficult? At one time, you're going to have a lot of people paying attention. On the other hand, you've got 200 races to follow in the state.
I don't know. It is what it is. I think it probably makes it a little easier to. Our problem as Democrats has been midterm turnout, and the more races on the ballot, the more attention we can draw to that, I think is going to be helpful to us in driving overall turnout for Democratic candidates. You are absolutely right. The governor's office is priority number one, along with making sure that Debbie Stabenow returns to the United States Senate. But we've also got House, Senate races, Supreme Court, Attorney General, Secretary of State. We're going to be working very hard to support all of them, but I think on balance, having that many things up is going to focus the attention of Democrats that everything is at stake this year, especially going into a census year in 2020 when we'll be talking about redistricting again very soon.
And that is a subject we probably should briefly talk about, redistricting. More attention has come to bear on the way redistricting is done, not just in Michigan, but across the country. I think former Chairman Mark Brewer has instituted a lawsuit that would take a look at how we do it. But at least for now, and until that is changed or settled, explain the importance, because I'm not sure that people understand that it is who controls the legislature who generally controls the way those lines are drawn in Michigan.
That's right. Very simply, every 10 years after we do the census and we look at where populations have shifted or whether we've lost or gained population, you have to redraw the lines to accommodate those changes. The party in control draws the line. So there is a natural incentive for them to make sure that those lines are favorable to their reelection prospects. And in Michigan, as in with Wisconsin, we've seen some of the worst gerrymandering of anywhere in the state. Democrats, by and large, since 2010, have gotten a majority of the vote in almost every statewide count for state House and state Senate, yet we continue to remain in the minority and in a super minority in the Senate. So the idea of redistricting reform is to take that power out of the hands of people who will naturally benefit from those decisions and try to put it in the hands of nonpartisan folks to draw the lines based on strict criteria that does not include giving one party an artificial advantage over the other.
It sounds like a simple solution. It will not be a simple solution. All right, thanks to Chairman Dillon. Of course, we'll check back with him, and we'll be talking with his counterpart as well in a future To the Point. We'll be right back. So it was a big week in Washington. I think there's some big weeks yet to come. And we've still got that budget that's going on in Lansing. We'll cover it all next week. To the Point.